All right, this is the last portion of Chapter 21, and it's going to deal with the progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So, on September 14th, McKinley, President William McKinley, died after being shot by anarchist Leon Kozlakos. I'm sorry, I can't say his name very well. And at the age of 42, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, came into the presidency. This was somewhat worrying to a lot of conservative Republicans within the party. They kind of condemned him as a cowboy. He had something of a temper, and they thought he was impulsive. And so a little bit worried about him as president. Roosevelt was the son of an aristocratic New York family. He overcame a sickly childhood through bodybuilding exercises and summering in Wyoming to become a model of physical fitness, and so tended to enjoy that kind of thing as well for the rest of his life. Roosevelt served as a state assemblyman in New York State, the New York City Police Commissioner, a civil service commissioner. He was elected as New York's governor, and it was arranged by the Republican boss in New York to have him run for vice president, mainly to get him out of their hair in the state of New York. Roosevelt found the presidency to be energizing. He enjoyed it immensely. He enjoyed public life, and he enjoyed being in the limelight, and pretty much dominated the political landscape in the early progressive period. Early on in his presidency, events began to test his political skills. In 1902, you have the United Mine Workers Union call a strike to gain higher wages and shorter hours and recognition of the union from the company. The mine owners resisted, and with winter looming in October, Roosevelt acted. He brought both sides, both the union workers and the company, to the White House to arbitrate a negotiation and basically forced the company to accept arbitration. They were still reluctant to even deal with the union, but Roosevelt threatened to send federal troops in and operate the mine rather than shut down the strike. And so the company owners were forced to accept the negotiations. The commission granted the miners a 10% wage increase and reduced their working day from 10 to 9 hours as a result. Roosevelt's approach to labor disputes differed greatly from that of his predecessors. He tended to defend the workers' right to organize, whereas other Republicans before him were very staunchly against labor unions. With his elite background, Roosevelt didn't much fear, but he also didn't much like the business interests. He believed that corporations contributed to national greatness, but he also believed that they must be regulated. He was a strict moralist and so held corporations, much like individuals, to a very high standard. Roosevelt also understood that many Washington politicians didn't necessarily agree with his views. His progressive impulses tended to also remain very much in tension with his grasp of power realities in corporate America. Another test came when J.P. Morgan in 1901 formed United States Steel. In 1902, the State of the Union message that Roosevelt delivered called for breaking up business monopolies, or trust busting. In fact, it earned him a nickname as the Trust Buster. Roosevelt's Attorney General soon sued the Northern Securities Company, which was a giant holding company created by Morgan and other tycoons for controlling the railroad in the Northwest, saying that it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. In 1902, on a speaking tour, Roosevelt called for a square deal for all Americans and denounced special treatments for capitalists. He said, "We don't wish to destroy corporations, but we do wish to make them serve the public good." And in 1904, the Supreme Court ordered the Northern Securities Company dissolved as a result. While in office, Roosevelt's administration filed more than 40 antitrust lawsuits and broke up some rather notable companies most notably Standard Oil. As the 1904 election neared, Roosevelt made peace with Morgan and other business magnates, and in the GOP convention was nominated again for the presidency, and the party adopted a very pro-business platform, which encouraged about $2 million worth of business contributions to the campaign. In 1904, Roosevelt won really easily, and then turned to a second major goal, which was regulating the railroads. He saw corporate regulation as more effective than trust busting, and so in his second term as president, shifted his attention to that rather than trust busting. In 1906, the Hepburn Act was passed, and this empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to set maximum railroad rates in order to examine railroads' financial records, It also curtailed the practice of distributing free passes and other shapers of public opinion. This displayed Roosevelt's political skills very well. He agreed to delay tariff reform in return for railroad regulation, but failed to fully satisfy many of the reformers. Despite that, though, the Hepburn Act did drastically expand the government's regulatory power. Of all the progressive reforms, the campaign against unsafe food and drugs and medicine was especially popular. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906, which graphically described the conditions in some meatpacking plants. Roosevelt read the book and was frankly appalled by what it was describing, and so had a commission study what was happening there, and eventually advocated for the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as the Meat Inspection Act, which were both passed in 1906. The former outlawed the sale of adulterated food or drugs and required accurate ingredient labels, and the latter imposed strict sanitary rules on meat packers and set up a federal meat inspection system. Environmental concerns were also important for Roosevelt. By 1900, decades of expansion and urban industrial growth had taken a very heavy toll on the landscape, as we've described in previous chapters. While business interests and boosters preached exploitation of the West's resources, agricultural groups sought government aid for irrigation projects, and some urged wilderness preservation. So you have different groups pulling policy or attempting to pull policy in several different directions. In the early 20th century, amid spreading cities and factories, wilderness vogue began to sweep through America. Summer camps, as well as organizations like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, gave children a taste for wilderness living, and socially prominent Easterners also embraced the cause of preservation of the wilderness. Between enthusiasts and developers, you have government experts like Gifford Pinchot, who saw the public domain as a resource to be managed wisely, and so stressed conservation rather than preservation. Wilderness advocates welcomed Pinchot's opposition to mindless exploitation, but worried that his multiple-use approach would despoil the wilderness areas. Roosevelt himself was a preservationist at heart, but was able to see that conservation was probably the more moderate choice. Roosevelt, the politician, backed the conservationist call for planned development and supported the National Reclamation Act, which designated money from public land sales for water management in arid western regions. This measure ranks with the Northwest Ordinance for promoting settlement and productivity in the vast continental region, because now these arid regions become much more livable with the passage of that act. It and other measures in these years transformed the West from a series of isolated sort of island settlements to a thriving interconnected region, and the competition for scarce water resources also sparked bitter political battles. In the meantime, Roosevelt, embracing Pinchot's multiple-use land management program, set aside about 200 million acres of public land as national forests, mineral reserves, and water power sites until in 1907, through mainly through push from corporate interests, Congress revoked the president's authority to create national forests. They did, however, establish the National Park Service to manage the parks that he had set aside. So, in 1908, as the next election is nearing, Roosevelt pledges that he's going to stop at two terms, not seek a third. And the Republican Party, the conservative part of the Republican Party, actually is able to take back control of the party. They nominated Roosevelt's choice, William Howard Taft, as their candidate and selected a conservative vice presidential nominee, as well as adopting a very conservative platform. Democrats, meanwhile, nominated William Jennings Bryan and a platform which called for lower tariff, denouncing trust, and embraced the cause of labor. With Roosevelt's endorsement, Taft managed to win a relatively easy victory, and overall, the outcome suggested that there was maybe a lull in the reform movement. Not completely at an end, though. Republican conservatives welcomed Roosevelt's departure. Most of them were a little uneasy with him anyways. Taft was a prominent Ohio politician. He came from an Ohio political family and was very different from Roosevelt. Very much less into physical fitness than Roosevelt. Roosevelt loved the limelight. He loved public life. Taft was very much more quiet. He disliked controversy and actually enjoyed being a Chief Justice much more than being president. He did pledge to support Roosevelt's program, though. He backed the Mann-Elkins Act, which beefed up the Interstate Commerce Commission's regulatory power. He actually prosecuted more antitrust cases than Roosevelt had, but with very little publicity. The reform spotlight, meanwhile, shifted to Congress under Taft, where reform-minded Republicans began to challenge their party's conservative congressional leadership and fought a very bruising battle over the tariff. Taft first backed the insurgents' call for a lower tariff. This group were called the insurgents. High tariff advocates in Congress, however, pushed through a measure which raised duties on hundreds of items, and Taft signed the bill, but also praised it extravagantly, which angered a lot of his insurgent support. It was ultimately the Bollinger-Pinchot controversy which created an insurmountable rift between Taft and Roosevelt. Taft's Interior Secretary Richard Bollinger was a Seattle lawyer who favored unregulated private development of natural resources, and in 1909 approved the sale of several million acres of coal-rich public lands in Alaska to a Seattle business, who promptly resold it to J.P. Morgan and other financiers. When any Interior Department official protested, he was fired and went public. Even Gifford Pinchot, who we've mentioned a little bit earlier, and the Forest Service, when he criticized Bollinger's acts, he was also fired. And this made TR supporters who remained there very angry. Roosevelt, upon leaving office, left for Africa on safari, and when he came back, he was met by Pinchot, more or less on the docks, who told him this whole story. Openly breaking with Taft, Roosevelt began campaigning for insurgent candidates in the midterm elections. He was very dissatisfied with Taft's conduct during the controversy as he heard it, and proposed a new system called New Nationalism that would powerfully engage the federal government in reform. In 1910, the Democrats managed to recapture the House, and a coalition of Democrats and insurgent Republicans controlled the Senate. And Roosevelt increasingly began to sound like a presidential candidate again. In February of 1912, Roosevelt officially announces his candidacy for the Republican nomination, but Taft wanted a second term, and since Taft controlled the political machinery of the party, he was able to have a lot of Roosevelt's delegates that he won to the convention tossed out. This angered Roosevelt to no end, and so he decided to form a third party, the Progressive Party, and he ran on their ticket. The convention platform that was adopted by the Progressive Party endorsed most reform causes of the day, including lower tariffs, women's suffrage, business regulation, abolition of child labor, 8-hour workdays, and so on. And Roosevelt attracted quite a following after that. But the reform spirit also was infusing the Democratic Party, who decided to nominate Woodrow Wilson as their candidate. Taft more or less gave up. He was satisfied that he had denied Roosevelt the nomination and kept his party safe for conservatism. Wilson, by contrast, called his political vision the New Freedom. So you have essentially Roosevelt, who's running on the New Nationalism, and Wilson running on the New Freedom, with Taft more or less backing out. Corporations, Wilson argued, were choking off opportunity for ordinary Americans, and he evoked an era of small government, small business, and free competition. Roosevelt outpolled Taft by about 630 votes, but the Republican split was very costly. Wilson very easily won the presidency, and the Democrats managed to take both houses of Congress. The 1912 election very firmly linked the Democrats with reform as well. Roosevelt's third-party campaign demonstrated the continued appeal of reform among grassroots Republicans. And you also have Debs running on a socialist ticket who gets nearly 1 million votes, as we've kind of discussed before. In 1912, the presidential contest anticipated future political trends, which involved party primaries, continuous campaigning, celebrity endorsements, and a new mass media medium, which was the films. I have here on this slide a picture sort of depicting the 1912 election. You have there an elephant, and it's got GOP written on its back, although the G kind of looks like a C. And you have a moose there with glasses on and a Rough Rider's hat above its head. The Progressive Party was referred to as the Bull Moose Party, which is why the moose is there. And so you have both of them sitting there looking rather dejected. And there is a caption to it, although I don't think this image actually shows the caption, but it's basically the elephant going, well, look at what you did. You had to throw a tantrum and split the party, and this is what happens. I also have another image which we'll talk about at the end, which kind of portrays the same thing. But looking at Wilson's presidency, the progressive movement gains fresh momentum with Wilson as president. Congress enacts an array of reform measures under Wilson. Lowering tariff rates, which was a long goal of Southern and agrarian Democrats, was the top part of Wilson's agenda. Many progressives agreed that high protective tariffs increased corporate profits at the public expense, and so also backed the idea of tariff reform. Wilson actually appeared personally before Congress, which was a precedent which had long been abandoned by presidents, and called for a low tariff bill to be passed. The bill was passed quite quickly by the House, but it got bogged down in the Senate. Wilson denounced the lobbyists who were flooding into Washington as being part of the problem in closing that bill down. His censure of lobbyists eventually led to a Senate investigation of them and senators who profited from high tariffs. And stung by that publicity, the Senate not only passed the bill, but slashed tariff rates even lower. The Underwood-Simmons tariff, as it became known, reduced rates by an average of about 15% overall. Wilson again addresses Congress in June, this time calling for bank and currency reform. The banking system needed desperate overhaul. They lacked any kind of strong central institution, but there was no sort of consensus on specifics about how this would happen. A lot of reformers wanted a publicly controlled central banking system, but the nation's bankers favored a privately controlled system, similar to the Bank of England or to the early Bank of the United States. Others, including influential congressmen, opposed any kind of central banking authority. Wilson wasn't particularly a banking expert, but he did insist that the monetary system ultimately be publicly controlled, and so the result of this was the Federal Reserve Act. This created 12 regional federal banks under a mixed public-private control. And overall, the system was shared by the heads of, overall control of the system was shared by the heads of the 12 different regional banks, as well as members of the Washington-based Federal Reserve Board. And it was probably by far Wilson's greatest legislative achievement. In 1914, Wilson and Congress turned to business regulation. Two laws that ultimately resulted sought a common goal, but embodied two separate approaches. The Federal Trade Commission Act took an administrative approach. It created a watchdog agency, the Federal Trade Commission, with the power to investigate violations and required regular reports from corporations. The Clayton Antitrust Act, on the other hand, listed corporate activities which could lead to federal lawsuits. The Clayton Act spelled out specific illegal practices, unlike the Sherman Act before it, and so made it much more effective than the Sherman Act altogether. Wilson appointed some conservatives with big business links to the FTC, which initially made the agency ineffective. And under the Clayton Act, however, Wilson filed antitrust suits over nearly 100 corporations, so he was very active in that regard. Wilson supported labor unions as well as the workers' right to organize. In 1916, Wilson encouraged congressional Democrats to enact 3 worker protection laws. The Keating-Owen Act barred from interstate commerce products that were manufactured by child labor. The Adamson Act established an 8-hour workday for interstate railway workers, and the Workmen's Compensation Act provided accident injury protection for federal workers. However, Wilson's sympathies with workers tended to stop at the color line. Federal Farm Loan Act, the Federal Warehouse Act, Federal Highway Act, all of these also were passed under Wilson, so lots of reform measures going into play under him. The pro-business bias of the courts tended to be a weak spot for progressive reforms. In Mueller versus Oregon, for example, the Supreme Court upheld the Oregon law that limited female laundry and factory workers to a 10-hour workday. The law was successfully defended by a Boston attorney, Louis Brandeis, who cited legal precedent but also offered evidence in true progressive form. And although the court agreed to make an exception based on gender, the court continued to hold that, in general, worker protection laws violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So generally a very conservative stance, regardless of that one decision. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson nominated Brandeis to the Supreme Court, and Brandeis brought very much more reform-minded opinion to the court itself. The Conservative American Bar Association protested Brandeis' appointment, as did the Republican congressional leaders, and anti-Semites also tended to protest because Brandeis was Jewish. But his appointment was ultimately confirmed, and you see him advocating for a much more liberal lean to the court after that. These years also produced at least 4 constitutional amendments. The 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913 and empowered Congress to tax incomes. Income tax revenues would help to pay for the government's expanded regulatory duties and reform measures. The 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of U.S. senators by voters rather than selection by legislatures, essentially seeking to make the Senate less responsive to corporate influence and more responsive to the people. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and importation of intoxicating liquors, and the 19th Amendment granted women officially the right to vote. In 1916, Wilson wins the renomination, and the Progressive Party again court Roosevelt. But in 1916, you are in the midst, or the world is in the midst of a war, mainly in Europe, and Roosevelt is a bit distracted by that, and so told them to endorse Hughes, who was the regular Republican nomination, which effectively removed the Progressive Party from the contest and from future contests as well. with the Republicans more or less reunited, the election was much closer than it had been in 1912. War-related issues loomed large. Wilson managed to win the popular vote, but the Electoral College was in doubt for several weeks as California was counting and recounting votes. After 1916, and as the U.S. is entering the First World War, progressivism really loses steam at that point, and so that's basically the end of the era. So when we were talking about the election of 1912, I mentioned I had another image to show about it. And this one is invoking biblical imagery. You can see in the foreground Woodrow Wilson playing the character of Moses, and the Israelites are representing the American people who are being led through the Red Sea, which is identified as the Republican split, and away from the tyranny of Egypt, which is basically Republican government up until that point. And so it's very strong imagery. It comes from Puck, which is a Democratic-leaning news magazine, and obviously in support of Wilson. But I found the imagery to be very interesting and compelling, and that's why it's included here.